This is The Case of the Peculiar Portrait by T.G. Campbell, read from the second volume of the Bow Street Society Casebook. "Thank you for agreeing to this consultation, Miss Trent, despite my impertinence," Mrs. Clementine Barker said as she watched the cream billow into her tea. Her quiet voice was further muffled by her lace veil and frequent glances to the parlour door. Compared to Miss Trent's slender 5'7" form, the diminutive nature of Mrs. Barker's build was blatant. A cotton bustle dress topped with a satin rose print overlay and trimmed with lace concealed a tight corset. The veil and gloves covered her skin with black, thus making the assessment of her age, appearance, and social class difficult. Yet the Bow Street Society clerk attempted to determine them nonetheless. Based upon the occasional glimpse of vivid blonde ringlets through the veil and the strength of Mrs. Barker's vocal cords, Miss Trent placed her age somewhere between 25 and 35. By contrast, Miss Trent's attire comprised of a ruffle-necked satin blouse and a set of high-waist bustle skirt. The former was plain with a cameo pin to the collar's centre, underneath the ruffled edge. Her skirt, meanwhile, was a combination of plain and patterned panels. The blouse, plain panels, and embroidered rose pattern were dark purple in colour, with the last set against a cream background. Her shoulder-length chestnut-brown hair was styled into tight corkscrew curls, some of which framed her fair, unblemished face. Though also in her late 20s, Miss Trent's voice held far more life than her would-be client's. Furthermore, her dark brown eyes never strayed. "Not impertinence, Mrs. Barker, but practicality. Bow Street Society clients rarely require formal introductions because, in most instances, they are a waste of valuable time. You wanted to speak to me urgently, and I was in a position to grant your request. May I ask why you had your maid wait in the hallway, though, when she accompanied you here?" "Respectable women mustn't travel alone, but this matter isn't for a servant's ears." "Very well." Miss Trent set down her cup and saucer to retrieve her notebook and pencil laid beside the tray. "How may we help you this morning?" Mrs. Barker sat upon a high, triple balloon-shaped back tete-a-tete sofa that faced a large fireplace. The Bow Street Society clerk had taken the matching overstuffed armchair to the sofa's left, facing the parlour door. Each piece was upholstered in a navy blue fabric adorned with light blue embroidered leaves to mirror the rug laid out beneath a low table between the sofa and chair. Even the walls had a light blue leaf design to their bronze gilt wallpaper. Members' donations, recently added to the room, included a music box amongst the Dickens tomes upon the bookshelf and a taxidermy herring housed in a glass case on a table behind the door. "It's difficult to explain," Mrs. Barker bowed her head. "I've had a terrible time of it trying to decide if I should seek the Society's help at all. My husband's reassurances have brought me some comfort, but then the happenings reoccur, and I am once again plunged into the depths of despair." Mrs. Barker partially lifted her veil to sip her tea. "Please forgive me." She dropped the veil back into place. "I'm making little sense, but even now I'm conflicted. I've heard much of your group, particularly the fine work it has done for others, and don't wish to put either its time or resources to waste. Part of my role as the Society's clerk is to decide whether we accept a commission. I therefore need to hear the facts from each potential client we have. Rest assured, even if your case is declined, you wouldn't have wasted anything." Miss Trent attempted to meet Mrs. Barker's gaze through the veil. "Whatever your problem is, it's clearly caused you great distress." Mrs. Barker hesitated long enough for Miss Trent to suspect she was about to flee. Her lack of movement and visible expression compelled the clerk to hold her tongue, however. After several moments passed, Mrs. Barker rewarded Miss Trent's patience by folding back her veil. Her face was rounded and doll-like in its features. The robust blue eyes and faint crow's feet supported Miss Trent's earlier conclusion as to Mrs. Barker's age. "Thank you for your patience. I'm prone to hysteria. The events of these past few weeks have only served to strengthen it." Mrs. Barker balanced her teacup and saucer in her lap. "6 months ago, my first husband, Geoffrey Downton, drowned in the River Thames, while he, myself, and our mutual friend, Mr. Crichton Barker, were swimming." Miss Trent lifted a brow, but began her notes. "I can surmise your thoughts, and they would be correct. Mr. Barker and I married 3 months ago. His proposal was born from a desire to look after his late friend's one true love. He saw it as a way of honouring Geoffrey's memory. Crichton has been most generous with his patience and understanding since the happenings began." Her hands trembled against the teacup, and she took a shallow breath. "I'm being haunted. I'm convinced of it. The soul of my dear departed Geoffrey isn't at rest, and never could be, for, you see, his death was by my hand." Miss Trent's pencil paused. "Please, elaborate further, Mrs. Barker." Her tone was grave, and while awaiting the answer, she reflected upon the potential repercussions of not having more witnesses to hear the confession. "Geoffrey didn't wish to go swimming in the Thames. He said it was wretchedly filthy, but I insisted. I was told its waters would rid me of a tiresome cough. I should have listened to him." She gave a soft sob. "His body was found several miles downriver, washed up among timber and other unspeakable pollution." "Why do you believe he's haunting you?" "Geoffrey was photographed a year before he died. It's the only likeness I have of him, that both I and Crichton have of him. We therefore hung it in the parlour at home. Yet, a month ago, while I was sewing by the fire, I happened to look up at the portrait." Her face turned the same shade of white as her teacup. Geoffrey had vanished! The portrait was missing? No. The frame and photograph were in place, but Geoffrey wasn't. Where he had been standing was naught but the curtain and scenery. I fled from the room at once and sought out Crichton. We returned together and—" Her hand shook as she placed the teacup upon the tray. "Footprints, Miss Trent. Wet footprints." Mrs. Barker pressed her handkerchief against her nose, and tears ran down her cheeks. "They began at the fireplace and came toward us." "What was your husband's reaction?" Miss Trent continued her notes with more fervour. "He didn't see either the footprints or the empty photograph. He insisted the rug was dry and Geoffrey was still there. He even led me back to the portrait to prove it to me, but, alas, my senses continued to be deceptive until the next morning when I saw the truth of it." "Geoffrey had returned?" "Indeed." Mrs. Barker gave a gentle sniff and dabbed at the underside of her nose. "Crichton forgave my foolishness, yet I cannot forget those footprints." Mrs. Barker lowered her handkerchief. "Crichton knows of my strain. It's why we're here in London. He's arranged for us to attend the Savoy Theatre tonight with some friends of ours. We're staying at the hotel on Henrietta Street." "And the portrait?" Miss Trent looked up. Mrs. Barker grimaced. "It hangs upon the wall in our suite. I didn't want to bring it, but Crichton reminded me of its importance to us both. He wanted Geoffrey to share our enjoyment while in London, if only in spirit." Mrs. Barker shuddered. "I can't bear to look upon it, Miss Trent. I am too afraid of what mightn't be there." Miss Trent closed her notebook. "Our members will have to see it, though, Mrs. Barker, if they're to have any hope of discovering the cause of these happenings." "Yes, of course." Mrs. Barker replaced her veil. "But Crichton is unaware of this visit. I didn't want to worry him further, you see. He would have tried to reassure me, but even he can do little to ease my distress now. I must know if I am mad, or if—" Another sob sounded from beyond the lace as Mrs. Barker stood like a jack-in-the-box. She at once turned toward the door, but paused to add, "Crichton is having luncheon with a business associate at midday today. Miss Doris Cooper, my maid, will also be out visiting her family in Stepney." Mrs. Barker put her hand upon the parlour door's knob. "We are in room 13. She then left the room to collect her servant while Miss Trent rose to unbolt the front door. Located in Westminster, Henrietta Street was but a short cab ride from Bow Street. It was therefore close enough to the Royal Opera House on that thoroughfare, and the Savoy Theatre that adjoined the prestigious Savoy Hotel to be convenient, yet still far enough to avoid the inevitable noise caused by the crowds of stage connoisseurs as they journeyed home. The hotel where the Barkers stayed wasn't as luxurious as the Savoy, but it boasted a reputation of respectability among the middle classes nonetheless. Its front elevation comprised of stone arched doorways bookending 4 tall square windows. Iron railings lined the hotel's perimeter and followed the door's shallow flights of stone steps. The hotel's lounge, filled with overstuffed armchairs and faux antiques, could be seen beyond the windows. An immense decorative oak fireplace housed an equally impressive hearth where a strong fire burned. Its light illuminated the room with an orange glow, accentuated by nearby low-burning kerosene lamps and brass candle-lit chandeliers. Veteran businessmen, dour-faced widows, and young ladies chaperoned by paid companions made up the hotel's middle-class clientele. Though the air was mild, a gloom had fallen upon Henrietta Street due to dense cloud cover. Mr. Virgil Verity therefore turned his gaze skyward as he alighted from the Bow Street Society's cab. He was pleased to see light grey clouds rather than dark. There was sufficient time to get inside before the rain at least. A wholesome off-white beard, moustache, and wrinkled riddled grey complexion denoted his 60 years. Yet, despite his advanced age, he had a full head of thick silver hair. His chosen attire was a dark green and brown tweed suit with a black waistcoat beneath. Both were hidden under a thick black woolen overcoat that hung to his ankles, a knitted dark green scarf, and broad-brimmed brown hat. Hearing his companion alight from the cab also, he shuffled around to offer her his arm. Miss Georgina Dexter placed her slender hand in the crook of his elbow as she graced him with a warm smile. Like Mr. Verity, she wore a heavy winter coat, hers being midnight blue in colour. Beneath she wore a modest pale blue dress with a high ruffled neck and straight-line skirts. A midnight blue bonnet, lined with black lace, sat atop her head and provided the perfect backdrop to her pinned auburn hair. Like Mr. Verity, Miss Dexter was fair-skinned, but hers was unblemished by the passage of time. Her green eyes were also as keen as his brown. Due to her petite build, and Mr. Verity's stoop as he walked, it would appear to the casual observer that they were the same height. In reality, Mr. Verity was taller than Miss Dexter by 2 feet, she being 5 foot exactly. The obvious difference in age, there were 42 years between them, meant they could be mistaken for grandfather and granddaughter too. Nevertheless, they entered the hotel together and sought out room 13 on the 2nd floor. "Mrs. Clementine Barker?" Mr. Verity inquired from the young lady who opened the door. For a moment his strong Tyneside accent had cast a shadow of confusion upon her features. When she had fathomed her own name from his statement, she gave a polite smile. "Oh, yes, I'm she, and you are—" "Are you alone?" Mr. Verity inquired. "I am," Mrs. Barker replied. "Then I'm Mr. Virgil Verity, a retired school teacher and spiritualist, and this is Miss Georgina Dexter, a freelance artist with a knack for photography. We're also members of the Bow Street Society. Miss Trent sent us." Mrs. Barker stepped aside at once. "Please, come in." She closed the door behind them. "May I presume Miss Trent has told you of my problem?" Mr. Verity nodded and looked around the living room. It was one of 4 rooms which made up the Barkers' hotel suite. The others were their bedroom with an ensuite bathroom, and Miss Cooper's room. The furniture was sparse but clean and neat. 2 armchairs by the warm hearth, a round table with 3 chairs by the window overlooking Henrietta Street, an untouched bureau in the corner, a tapestried fire screen, and potted plants. Hung upon the chimney breast, against the cream and brown striped wallpaper, was a monochrome photograph of a handsome gentleman in his early 20s. He stood with his hand upon a table, a drawn-back curtain over his right shoulder, and a painted countryside scene behind him. The portrait was kept in a bronze-painted wooden frame with hand-carved floral embellishment. "I must apologise for your wasted journey and time, Mr. Verity, Miss Dexter. As you can see, the portrait is as it should be, and has been since we arrived in London." Mrs. Barker released a deep sigh. "I fear I was in too much haste to call upon the Bow Street Society's assistance. I'll pay your fee, of course." "If you'll permit me, Mrs. Barker, I'd still like to examine the portrait," Miss Dexter said, her voice both unobtrusive and reassuring in its gentleness. "By all means," Mrs. Barker replied with a soft smile and relaxation of her shoulders. Miss Dexter stood, and stepping onto the half-tiled floor, reached up to lift the frame off its hook. Placing it upon the cushioned seat of her armchair, she held its top with one hand and leant forward to inspect its front. "The photograph's clarity and tonal depth suggests dry gelatine plates were used. That means we may be able to get copies if needed." She turned the portrait toward the firelight and tilted it backward while she inspected its bottom corners. Seeing only the photograph, she hummed and laid the frame face first against the armchair's backrest. Next she slipped her fingernails between the frame and the layer of thick paper backing that kept the photograph in place. For a second time she leaned forward, but this time inspected the corners of the photograph's rear. "Here we are," Miss Dexter beamed. "E. F. Langdon of Regent Street, London. He must have captured Mr. Downton's likeness." She returned the paper backing and, with Mr. Verity's assistance, rehung the portrait. "I would very much like to visit Mr. Langdon. He may be able to provide us with additional information." Mr. Verity dropped down into his armchair with a soft grunt. "I agree." Once Miss Dexter sat across from him, and Mrs. Barker had taken a chair at the table, he inquired, "Was your late husband a generous man? I don't want to talk out of turn, but it could be important if he left you some money of your own." Mrs. Barker frowned as the shadow of confusion fell upon her features again. "Could it be, though? I don't see how." She looked at the portrait and took some courage from its continued mundaneness. "But, yes, he was very generous, Mr. Verity. I have a yearly allowance from his estate. It remains my property until my own death, when it reverts to Geoffrey's only living blood relative, a niece in America." Mr. Verity slipped his crooked finger through his beard to scratch the underside of his chin. "Miss Trent told us you'd seen wet footprints coming from the portrait, too. Have they come back?" Mrs. Barker shook her head. "And no one else has ever seen them. Perhaps Crichton is right in his assertion I'm allowing my rational feelings of guilt to overcome my rationality." "We don't know that until we do some checking of our own," Mr. Verity replied. "In my experience, spirits and phantoms come out when it's dark. I want to come back tonight, then, to watch the portrait and see what it does, if anything." Mrs. Barker looked to the window as tension crept into her body. "Impossible, I'm afraid." She took in several shallow breaths and stood, her fingers toying with the lace of her cuff. "Crichton and I are attending a Gilbert and Sullivan opera at the Savoy Theatre tonight. Miss Cooper, my maid, will still be visiting her family." She crossed the room and reached for the door. "I really do think I've wasted your time." "I don't," Mr. Verity retorted in an authoritative tone. Mrs. Barker stopped with her hand upon the doorknob and looked back sharply. Seeing this, and the wildness of her eyes, Mr. Verity leaned upon his cane and heaved himself onto his feet. Miss Dexter rose too, and walked behind him as he shuffled toward their client. "You afraid? That's okay, lass. We want to stop you being afraid, but we can't do that if you don't let us come back tonight." But the theatre, Crichton," Mrs. Barker mumbled. "Give us a key now, and we'll let ourselves in," Mr. Verity replied. "We'll slip it under the door once we've finished," Miss Dexter added. "If the portrait's haunted, as you fear it is, Geoffrey might leave it when you're not here. I'd like to see that happen for myself. He'll probably manifest himself if he doesn't think anyone's watching," Mr. Verity explained. Mrs. Barker pursed her lips together and shivered. "You really think he'd—" "If he's there, yes," Mr. Verity replied. Mrs. Barker released a soft sob and pressed a clenched hand to her lips. As her entire body trembled, she whispered, Will you tell him I'm sorry?" Her hand slipped from the doorknob and she walked toward Mr. Verity with tears in her eyes. "That I never meant—" Mr. Verity closed the distance between them. I will. I promise. Mrs. Barker gave a sad smile. Thank you. She sniffed hard and pressed the back of her hand to her lips. Thank you. Taking out her handkerchief, she dabbed at her eyes as she walked past Mr. Verity and took a key from the mantel-shelf. Here. She pressed it into Miss Dexter's hand. Please also tell him how much I love him. Miss Dexter gave a gentle nod and squeezed her client's hand. I shall. Mr. Geoffrey Downton. His likeness was captured around 1.5 years ago, you said? Mr. Langton inquired while he browsed through his store of used plates. Mr. Langton was in his mid-40s with short chestnut-brown hair combed with a right side parting. His build was lean and his height exceeded 6 feet. Thus his appearance was akin to a malnourished giant. The soft drawl of his voice and warm brown eyes gave him a gentle air, however. Yes, he was alone at the time, Miss Dexter replied. She stood beside Mr. Langton as he searched. She recognised the plates as the factory-produced glass kind coated in gelatine, containing silver salts. Each one of Mr. Langton's plates depicted the ghostly visage of individuals, couples or family groups. They were housed within wooden frames to prevent accidental breakages or scratching, which had the names of the subjects and the date of capture written in pencil on their top sides. Mr. Langton lifted each plate from its dedicated slot and read the label against the weak light of his kerosene lamp. Miss Dexter watched him with keen interest as she continued, We've seen his portrait and your address on his back. The small room in which the two met sat adjacent to the larger one that acted as his studio proper. Located on the first floor of Mr. Langton's printer's shop, the studio was accessed by a set of narrow steps in the shop's back parlour. The ceiling between this floor and the attic had been removed to allow the daylight to pour in through the windows. A thick black velvet curtain drawn across the doorway of the small room blotted out this light to ensure the plates weren't faded. Pieces of scenery rested against the studio's walls behind faux stone pillars in the Grecian style, a chaise-longue, various shaped and sized chairs, and numerous potted ferns and bushes. Mr. Verity sat on the chaise with both hands upon the silver skull-shaped handle of his walking cane between his knees. He looked over the stacked scenery, and one in particular caught his eye. I found it, Mr. Langton said, and held the framed glass over the weak lamp for Miss Dexter to examine. Mr. Geoffrey Downton. His likeness was captured on the 5th of May, 1895. Thank you, Mr. Langton, Miss Dexter replied. We may need a copy of it later. Certainly, Mr. Langton said with a smile and placed the plate into its slot. Shutting the lid of the trunk used to store the plates, he held the curtain open for the young artist to walk under. Following her into the studio, allowing the curtain to drop behind him as he did so, he inquired from Mr. Verity, Can I be of any further assistance? We wish to know the name of anyone who has recently requested for a countryside scene, table and curtain to be photographed, Miss Dexter replied. That one, Mr. Verity added, and pointed to the scenery he had noticed, a country lane framed by trees. It was half hidden behind another of a Grecian garden. That's the same one Mr. Downton had, wasn't it? Mr. Langton wandered over and lifted the garden scene to scrutinise the countryside one. I believe so, yes. He rested one arm across his stomach and then his other elbow upon his arm, while he tapped his chin with 3 fingers. I think I recall. Yes. Around 6 weeks ago, a young woman had a photograph of this scenery, the table and the curtain taken. I can't believe it never occurred to me that it would be the same in Mr. Downton's photograph. But why would it? Mr. Verity pointed out. Mr. Langton gave a slight shrug of his shoulder. Can you recall her name? Miss Dexter inquired. Mr. Langton hummed and pulled some pince-nez from his trouser pocket. Crossing to his desk, he balanced the pince-nez upon his nose and flipped through a ledger until he found the relevant entry. Rather than read aloud the name, though, he peered over its pince-nez at the two. Forgive me, Mr. Verity, Miss Dexter. But why do you want this information? We believe she might be using the portrait to frighten someone, Mr. Verity replied. Most cruelly, Miss Dexter added. I see. Mr. Langdon frowned. How terrible. Well, I think this is who you're looking for. He spun the ledger around so they could see the entry for themselves. Miss Doris Cooper. The hotel was quieter in the evening. The majority of its guests had departed for the restaurants and theatres. Thus, Mr. Verity and Miss Dexter didn't encounter anyone but the hotel employees when they traversed the stairs and corridors to room 13. Yet, as they turned the corner, a gentleman in evening wear left the Barkers' suite. He was in his late 40s with thin, pale blonde hair, dark blue eyes, and a stocky build. Mr. Verity retreated and ushered Miss Dexter to join him. When they next heard the heavy tread of the gentleman's approach, Mr. Verity leaned forward and feigned a coughing fit. While Miss Dexter rubbed his back, the gentleman hurried around the corner, but stopped when he came upon the sudden obstruction. Taking a brief moment to compose himself, he then walked around them and down the corridor to the stairwell door. Despite their brief encounter, Mr. Verity doubted the gentleman had paid them much heed. His eyes had shifted in all directions with sweat on his forehead and his evening suit dishevelled. When he heard the stairwell door close, Mr. Verity shuffled across the corridor and said, "The window." Miss Dexter followed, and they peered down at Henrietta Street. A hansom cab waited by the curb, and within minutes the gentleman emerged from the hotel and climbed inside. Though they couldn't hear what he said to the driver, if anything, the cab pulled away in the direction of the Savoy Theatre. A heartbeat later, the Bow Street Society's own cab passed beneath the window to follow the first. "Mr. Barker, I presume?" Miss Dexter whispered. "Probably," Mr. Verity replied. "He looked frightened." "He did." Mr. Verity shuffled back to room 13. I wonder if Mr. Downton showed himself earlier than expected. When he opened the door, though, the shaft of light from the hallway came to rest upon a lifeless form lying upon the hearth rug. Miss Dexter gasped, rushed inside and knelt beside it. Finding an unconscious woman in her early 20s, Miss Dexter tried to rouse her with a shake of her shoulder. When she pulled away her hand, she found blood smeared across her palm. "Mr. Verity!" The spiritualist shuffled over and seeing the blood got down on one knee. As he gripped his cane to steady himself with one hand, his other reached around to hover by the woman's lips. "She still breathes," he remarked. "Where's the blood coming from?" "Here, I think," Miss Dexter replied, indicating where an ornate hat-pin protruded from the woman's shoulder. "Don't move her," Mr. Verity instructed, and heaved himself back onto his feet. The lamp upon the table was lit with a small flame. He therefore increased its size to illuminate the room proper, while Miss Dexter closed the door. As she returned to the fallen woman, though, she noticed a photograph tucked beneath her arm. Its frame was identical to the one around Mr. Downton's portrait, but its content comprised of just the painted countryside scenery, a table, and a curtain. "This must be the photograph taken by Mr. Langdon several weeks ago," Miss Dexter observed, and slipped it out from under the fallen woman. "And this Miss Doris Cooper, then?" Mr. Verity inquired as he glanced to the woman. "But where's Mr. Downton's portrait?" Miss Dexter had looked to the chimney breast to find it bare. Mr. Barker wasn't carrying anything when he left, and Mrs. Barker knew we were returning this evening. A sudden groan from the woman distracted them, however. Miss Dexter moved backward and stood behind the armchair, the photograph grasped against her chest. She and Mr. Verity watched the woman lift her head, open her eyes, and push herself up onto her knees. A second groan escaped her while she sat upon her heels, but when she reached to hold her head, her body jerked as she yelped. She then clutched her wounded shoulder and noticed the two Bow Streeters. Her other arm immediately wrapped around her stomach, and she shuffled around on her behind to put her back to the cold hearth. "Who are you?" the woman demanded. "Miss Regina Dexter and Mr. Virgil Verity of the Bow Street Society, Miss Cooper," Miss Dexter replied. How did you know it was me? Miss Cooper inquired, stunned. Mere assumption, I'm afraid, Miss Dexter replied. Why did Mr. Barker harm you? Miss Cooper dropped her head and pursed her lips. In due course she replied, without taking her eyes off the other armchair. I've no idea. Yet, almost at once, she straightened, parted her lips, and scrutinised the floor to her left and right in quick succession. I have it here, Miss Dexter said, and turned the frame around to show Miss Cooper. Why was it under your arm? Were you about to hang it in place of Mr. Downton's portrait? Miss Dexter stepped around the armchair and rested the frame's edge upon its arm. That's how you've led Mrs. Barker to believe Mr. Downton has been leaving his photograph, isn't it? By switching his for this one and, in collusion with Mr. Barker, insist Mr. Downton's portrait was still intact and visible to you both. Don't forget the wet footprints, Mr. Verity interjected. Which would explain why Mr. Barker harmed you, Miss Dexter resumed. Why, Miss Cooper? Why would you be so cruel to your mistress? Miss Cooper bowed her head, but kept her arm wrapped tight around her stomach. Oh, Miss Dexter said, as the realization dawned upon her. You are with child? Mr. Barker's? Mr. Verity inquired, and shuffled forward to sit on a chair by the table. At Miss Cooper's curt nod, he continued, It was dark in here when we found you. If it was the same when Mr. Barker put that hat pin in your shoulder, he probably thought he'd got your neck. We saw him in the hallway, Miss Dexter said. He looked so frightened we thought Mr. Downton's ghost may have appeared before him. It would appear instead, like he thought he'd murdered you. All of what we found out so far has you behind the portrait happenings, Mr. Verity began. You had the new photograph taken at Mr. Langdon's studio, and we found you with it under your arm. When Mr. Barker finds out you live, he will make sure the police get rid of you for him. And unfortunately, a gentleman's word is worth more than a servant's, Miss Dexter pointed out, concerned. You must help me, Miss Cooper pleaded as she leaned toward them. It's true, all of it, but I can't let my baby be born in Newgate. Please, I only agreed to help him because he promised we'd be together once his wife was put in an asylum. I was trying to save us from the workhouse. Mr. Verity took in a slow, deep breath. Our priority is Mrs. Barker and her happiness. Exposing Mr. Barker's cruel scheme would help us with that, but you must confess your part too. Will the Bow Street Society protect me and my child? We can't guarantee that, Miss Cooper, Miss Dexter replied, but we'll endeavour to do our best for you both. Okay, Miss Cooper grimaced. Tell me what to do. You can begin by showing us where Mr. Downton's portrait is, Miss Dexter replied. The sound of wheels and hooves over cobblestones came through the open living-room window of the Barker's suite as a cab approached. When both ceased, the metallic scrape of a bolt filled the otherwise silent street, followed by the bounce of two doors against their hinges. Next, a male's deep voice was heard to instruct, "Go inside where it's warm, Clementine. I'll be along presently." Mrs. Barker replied, "But I—" "Yes, darling." Her heeled shoes tapped against the damp stone as she climbed the steps and entered the hotel. Meanwhile, Mr. Barker inquired, "How much did we agree upon again?" A reply was given, but the words were indistinguishable at that distance. The next to be understood were therefore Mr. Barker's. "Are you quite certain of that?" "She'll be here any time now," Mr. Verity whispered from the right of the suite's door. Miss Dexter, who sat by the window, swallowed and rubbed her clasped hands together in her lap as she nodded. She next watched Miss Cooper open the suite's door and peer out into the deserted hallway beyond. All three held their breaths as they listened for the rustle of Mrs. Barker's skirts and the distinct tap of her heels. "I don't care what you think. We agreed on a much lower price than that," Mr. Barker said. "You can't cheat me simply because I'm a visitor to London." "With all due respect, sir, the price I've said is the price we agreed," a second raised but calm voice replied. Miss Dexter recognised it as belonging to the Bow Street Society's cabman, Mr. Samuel Snyder. "You people don't know the meaning of respect," Mr. Barker retorted. Miss Cooper widened the gap in the door as she heard the stairwell's one close, followed by Mrs. Barker's heels against the carpet and the swift rustle of her skirts. "Mrs. Barker," she whispered when she saw her mistress come into view. "Mrs. Barker, hurry!" "Doris?" Mrs. Barker gasped, but rushed to greet her nonetheless. "What's happened?" Miss Cooper took her mistress by the arm and led her inside. "There's no time to explain, but the Bow Street Society is here, and they need your help." Mrs. Barker glanced to Miss Dexter by the window, and then Mr. Verity when he shuffled up beside her. "You do?" Miss Barker inquired from him. "Why? Did Geoffrey not show himself?" "No, and I don't think he ever will," Mr. Verity admitted with a deep frown. "But there is a dark influence on your life, and it can be exorcised if you'll do as we ask." "That's the fare, sir. I can fetch a constable if you want," Mr. Snyder said. "Yes, of course, Mr. Verity. What do you want me to do?" Mrs. Barker inquired. "No," Mr. Barker sighed. "There'll be no need for that." "Miss Cooper is going to lie on the rug by the hearth," Mr. Verity began. "When she's ready, we want you to scream as loud as you can and then lie on the floor like you fainted." Mrs. Barker stared at him a moment. Will you repeat that, please?" "Please, ma'am, there's no time to explain," Miss Cooper urged as she led Mrs. Barker toward the hearth and lay down. "You must trust them or all is lost." Turning onto her stomach, she positioned herself to mimic the manner in which she had been found earlier. As she did so, though, the hatpin that was still embedded into her shoulder was revealed. Mrs. Barker gasped in horror and reached down to remove it, yet Miss Dexter lunged forward and gripped her wrist to stay her. "But it's the one from my hat," Mrs. Barker explained as they heard shoes scrape against stone outside. When Mrs. Barker felt around in her hat, though, she widened her eyes and pulled out the very hatpin she thought she'd lost. I don't understand." She looked to Miss Dexter. "What's happening here?" "Your husband attacked Miss Cooper this evening," Miss Dexter whispered. "I promise we shall explain at length, but first you must do as we ask." Mrs. Barker trembled as she leaned against Miss Dexter. "Quickly now," Mr. Verity urged from his spot by the suite's door. Mrs. Barker looked around as if in a daze, but finally gave a slow nod. "Very well. I shall do as you ask." Miss Dexter smiled and gave Mrs. Barker's hand a gentle squeeze. While she moved to stand with her back against the wall to the left of the suite's door, Miss Barker put herself at Miss Cooper's feet, filled her lungs, and released a blood-curdling scream. Immediately afterward, she sat upon the floor and lay back, her arms limp above her head in a feigned faint. "That came from my suite," Mr. Barker cried from the stairwell. Those in the suite listened to the chaos that followed, the frenzied footfalls of Mr. Barker running up the stairs with several others, and the holler from somewhere inside the hotel for a constable to be fetched. "Room 13, Mr. Barker boomed as he and the others erupted from the stairwell and into the corridor. "Hurry!" Many feet thundered on the carpet, and Mr. Barker was the first to appear when the suite's door burst open. Rather than rush inside, though, he stopped dead in the doorway, thereby preventing the others from both seeing and accessing the scene of devastation beyond. "Oh, dear God!" he cried. "Clementine, what have you done?" "Let us in, sir," an unfamiliar male voice, possibly the hotel's desk clerk, requested from the corridor. Mr. Barker then stepped forward, as the weight of bodies unbalanced him, but quickly turned and gripped the doorframe. "No! Please! She's my wife, and she's not well. Let me talk to her. I don't want her harming herself too." Those in the corridor talked amongst themselves for a moment. A sudden yell from the stairwell then informed them a constable would arrive soon, however. "In that case, please proceed, sir," the unfamiliar male voice told Mr. Barker. "Thank you, gentlemen," Mr. Barker replied. He stepped back to close the door, but once it was locked, he turned upon his heel and strode over to the right-hand armchair. The cushion upon its seat was lifted, and a large square object wrapped in black cloth was revealed beneath. Mr. Barker pulled it out from its hiding-place and, whilst he held it in one hand, slipped a framed photograph out from beneath Miss Cooper's arm with his other. The latter was then laid upon the armchair's base and covered with the cushion, before he uncovered the former. As the cloth fell away, Miss Dexter and Mr. Verity saw Mr. Geoffrey Downton's distinct portrait in the dim lamplight. They watched as Mr. Barker tucked it under Miss Cooper's arm, stepped across to his wife and ran his fingertips over her hat in search of her pin. "Where is it?" he hissed. "Lost something, darling?" Mrs. Barker suddenly inquired as she opened her eyes, sat up and held the lost pin aloft for him to see. Mr. Barker stumbled back in fright and fell upon the armchair, his eyes wide and the colour draining from his face. "Clementine, you're enlightened, Crichton," Mrs. Barker replied with disgust. Mr. Barker looked then to Miss Cooper as she too sat up and glared at him. He visibly trembled at the sight, but though he moved his lips, no sound came out. Meanwhile, Mr. Verity unlocked and opened the suite's door to permit the others to enter. At the same time, Miss Dexter turned up the lamp and waved down to Mr. Snyder to let him know they were unhurt. Mr. Barker's wide eyes darted from her to Mr. Verity, to his wife, to Miss Cooper, to those gathered at the doorway, and back again to his wife. You tricked me!" His jaw muscles tensed. "What the devil's going on?" "Fraud, Mr. Barker, and a cruel one at that," Mr. Verity replied with a grave expression and sombre tone. "A fraud concocted by you and your lover, Miss Doris Cooper." Mr. Barker glanced to the doorway as the constable hurried inside and stepped behind the others. "I was called for," the constable explained. "You were. Arrest these people," Mr. Barker demanded. "Constable, I'm Mr. Virgil Verity of the Bow Street Society, and this is my friend, fellow member and freelance artist, Miss Georgina Dexter. Mrs. Barker hired our group to discover if the portrait of her late husband was haunted or not. We've discovered it wasn't, and that her husband and her maid had been switching the portrait, with one showing only scenery, a table and a curtain, to make her think her late husband had been leaving his own photograph. They also made wet footprints on the carpet to convince her even more." "You what?" the constable inquired, confused. "And why would I want to do something as idiotic as that?" Mr. Barker challenged. "To control your wife's allowance from her late husband's estate," Miss Dexter replied, and moved to be at Mr. Verity's side. "She told us she inherited the money as her own, and, when she dies, it reverts to her late husband's niece who lives in America. If Mrs. Barker was committed to an asylum, though, you could keep the allowance for yourself." "But if that was his intention, why did he attack Doris?" Mrs. Barker inquired, confused. "She knew of what he was doing, and she carries his bairn. So those are two reasons," Mr. Verity explained. "The third is, he could tell the police you were driven mad by the idea of your late husband's haunting you, and you killed Miss Cooper because of that madness. That's why he used a hat pin the same as the one you wore tonight, to make sure the police thought you'd used it to kill Miss Cooper, and why he tried to steal yours from you when he thought you'd fainted. He switched the photograph without Mr. Downton in it for the one with him, and hid the first, as you wouldn't be believed when you told the police you didn't see Mr. Downton in the photograph when you found it on Miss Cooper's body." "Don't be absurd," Mr. Barker retorted. "I was at the Savoy Theatre all evening, watching a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. Ask our friends, Mr. and Mrs. Wetherell. Ask the ushers at the theatre. I never left once." "But you did," Mr. Verity replied. "Miss Dexter and me saw you leave this room when you were meant to be out. And the Bow Street Society's own cab, driven by a friend, Mr. Samuel Snyder, followed yours when it left," Miss Dexter interjected. "He's outside now, Constable, if you'd like to ask him where Mr. Barker went after he left here." She shifted her gaze to Mr. Barker. "From the corridor, Mr. Verity and I watched you get into the cab Mr. Snyder's followed." Mr. Barker grimaced. "I'll do that, don't you worry, miss," the constable replied. "Where's the photograph without Mr. Downton in it?" "Underneath the cushion Mr. Barker's sitting on," Miss Dexter replied. The constable straightened his tunic and stepped around the group to approach Mr. Barker. "Stand up, please, sir." Mr. Barker glanced from the constable to his wife, to Miss Cooper, and back again. With a deep sigh, he put his hands upon the chair's arms and stood. The constable at once took a firm grip of him and tossed the cushion onto the floor. Mr. Geoffrey Downton's eyes stared up at them. "I think you'd better come along with me, sir." The constable picked up the photograph, pulled Mr. Barker away from the armchair, and led him to the suite's open door. "I'll need you all to come along too. Statements will have to be taken at the police station." "We'll bring Mrs. Barker and Miss Cooper with us in Mr. Snyder's cab," Mr. Verity replied. The constable agreed, and frog-marched Mr. Barker downstairs. Mr. Verity and Miss Dexter meanwhile helped up Mrs. Barker and Miss Cooper from the floor. They would then accompany them on a tense cab ride followed by incredible discussions with a most perplexed Metropolitan Police Inspector.